Hello. Today is the last day of teaching before the Christmas holidays, so with what's left of my brain cells, I thought I would celebrate and tell a Russian story, something suitably Christmassy. It's one of the versions of the story of Snegurochka, the Snow Maiden, and her old grandfather, Ded Moroz, Grandfather Frost. Long, long ago, the Maiden of Snow, Snegurochka herself, danced through the forests of Siberia, and wherever her foot landed upon the pine needles on the floor, snow would fall in her wake. Icicles would form from the branches of the trees. Frost would ripple across the land like a great white mist enveloping her, as if the train of her dress spread and spread and spread. She was the daughter of the Queen of Spring and of the old man of winter himself, old Grandfather Frost. And she took after her grandfather, for deep within her was a coldness that spread out into the world. Year after year after year after year, she would awaken at the start of winter and dance across the earth, leading her old grandfather in her wake. And come the spring, her mother would visit her and kiss her upon the forehead, and Snegurochka would fall into a deep sleep all through the summer, only to awaken again the next winter, and of the entire cycle to start once more. With her grandfather accompanying her on their long travels, sometimes by foot, sometimes in a sled pulled by snow dogs, they would see much of the world, much of Russia, and sometimes they would go beyond into countries like Finland and explore further abroad in the lands of deep snow and deep frost. They saw many strange and wonderful things. They saw bears hibernating in caves. They saw wolves howling at the moon. They saw the creatures of the frosts and the snows that moved in their wake and came to worship and reverence them in their passage. Sometimes they would peek in at the windows of humans and watch the people going about their strange business in their little houses, chucking logs onto the fire, rubbing their hands, warming themselves by the flames, talking and drinking and laughing and singing and sometimes fighting and sometimes arguing, the way humans will. And in all of their many, many long adventures, from one century to the next, Snegurochka often wondered about human ways and animal ways. She would see the wolves pairing up, male and female alike deeply in love. She would see the bears sleeping in the caves, the male and the female snuggled up together. She would see the humans when she peeped in through the windows, sometimes holding each other's hands or placing arms around each other's shoulders and hugging and kissing. And in all of this she wondered, what must it be like to feel love, to feel companionship? She loved her grandfather, she loved her mother, but she had never felt love as a woman, only ever as a child. And she wondered what it would be like to experience that. And she spoke to her grandfather and said to old Grandfather Frost, please show me how I might open my heart, how I might embrace the warmth, the affection, the love that I see between male and female beasts, between male and female mortals. How may I do this? And the old man, his great long white beard flowing into the snow, his red hat upon his head, his great fur collars pulled around him, staff in hand, said, my child, you must not think in this way. Warmth and romance and love and passion, these are for beings of flesh and blood, not creatures of snow and ice such as we. We may travel the world, we may see many adventures, we may have friends, we may laugh, we may rejoice, we may share in the comings and the goings of mortal kind, but we can never quite feel it ourselves. And this he said to her every time she asked. And eventually, one day, towards the end of one winter, she asked of her mother, when her mother, the Queen of the Spring, arrived. In the moments before, her mother kissed her upon her forehead and put her into the deep sleep. Mother, what is it like to love, to be warm, to be joyful? Are you as cold and chilly as I am inside, as old Grandfather Frost is inside? And her mother, being a creature of the spring, of the warmth and light, said, my child, no. In my heart beats as much passion and love and desire and lust and joy as any human ever experiences, as any wolf or swan or bird or beast of the forest ever experienced. And because you are half my child and half Grandfather Frost's child, you partake some of his nature but also some of mine, and that is why you dream of these things, whilst your grandfather does not. And thinking upon this, the woman of spring, the Queen of Spring, took a heart-shaped garland from off her belt, where many garlands and posies of flowers and great long daisy chains strung around her being. She took it off and she handed it to Snegurochka and then kissed her upon her forehead, and the girl fell into a deep sleep, deep safe within the earth, clutching that heart-shaped wreath. And the months of spring and summer rolled past into the autumn, and finally it came time for winter again. And Grandfather Frost woke in the far distant north, and he came down to where Snegurochka was sleeping. And there he beat his staff upon the ground, and the noise echoed deep into the earth. And the Frost Maiden, the Snow Maiden, awoke. But this time she awoke clutching that same heart-shaped wreath that she had held all summer long. And this time her heart was stirred with warmth. And as she travelled around with her grandfather, they came to a small, humble wooden house owned by a young woodsman called Lel. And when they peeked in at the window, they saw him, a big brawny lad with bright blonde hair, feeding logs upon the fire, warming his hands by the flames. He was tall, he was brawny, he was handsome, he had a boyish innocence about him. And Snegurochka, because she was holding that wreath, she fell in love. And she said to old Grandfather Frost, let me stay a while and watch this young man, for my heart beats in a way it has never beaten before. And the old man, seeing what his seldom seen wife had given to the child of their union, with heavy heart said, you must do what you must do. And he continued on his wanderings, spreading the ice and the snow and the frost before him as it fell in ever greater piles upon the earth, ever greater mounds, covering like a great sea of snow. And still Snegurochka held back, and she watched through the window, watched that handsome young man coming and going and preparing his meals and tending to his duties within the little house. And eventually he became aware that he was being watched, and he turned and he saw for a fleeting instant the most beautiful face staring at him through the window, and at once started wondering who on earth it could be, thinking maybe it was one of the local village girls. He stepped outside to see who this silly woman was, standing in such deep snow where she could get frostbite. But there was no footprints in the snow except his own as he wandered out. And he called and he called, and he heard a laughter. He heard giggling off in the woods, and thinking to himself that some perhaps half-mad with frostbite young lady from the village had wandered off and was at this very moment about to die of hypothermia, he stepped back into the hut, pulled his thickest, heaviest coats about himself, pulled on his thickest, heaviest boots, and went out calling and calling, and still the laughter led him on and led him on and led him on, and he followed the sound until at length they came to a clearing with the moonlight streaming down upon the snow, and there, dancing and twirling, almost as delicate as a snowflake herself, spinning in the moonlight, was the most beautiful woman Lel had ever seen, and she, in her turn, looked at the so solid, so corporeal, so muscular and physical Lel, and she fell in love with him. Solidity and fluidity, dancing and dancing and dancing. And dance they did for many a long hour, until the cold began to eat its way into Lel's bones, and big and beefy as he was, he knew that if he stayed out much longer he would be as cold and dead as one of the icicles hanging from the tree branches. And he said to this beautiful woman who had told him her name and a little about herself as they danced to music the two of them alone could hear, he said, "Will you not come back to the hut with me? We can eat, we can drink, we can stay the night." And she'd only ever eaten the kinds of things that the immortals eat. They'd only ever drunk the kinds of wonderful liqueurs that the immortals drink, and marvellous as those things may be, who wants to eat the same thing all of the time? Occasionally people want to try something different, and she was developing a taste for mortal kind. And so she went with him back to his hut, and there he fed her stew, the first time she had tasted such a thing, and she found it strange and wonderful. And he gave her vodka the first time she had tasted such a thing, and she found it marvellous and magical. And they ate and they drank, and one thing led to another, and they made love all night long in front of the fire upon the sheepskin rug. And in the deep, deep snows, Grandfather Frost felt the time was coming, could feel his beloved child, his grandchild, dissipating in the heat. For as Lel fell into a deep slumber, as men will do after a long night of passion and vodka, Snegurochka, the heat of his body on one side, the heat of the fireplace upon the other, she was a creature of the snows and the ice, and she began to melt and melt and melt. And perhaps it was also in part at least the heat from her own heart that was beating with love and with passion. And so when Lel awoke in the morning, of the wonderful maiden he had spent the night with, there was nothing left but the heart-shaped wreath that she had had attached to her belt, that lay in the damp patch upon the sheepskin rug, and of what became of her he never knew. Never knew that it was his love that had dissolved her, the heat of his house that had dissolved her, the heat of her own passion that had dissolved her. But Daisy Moroz, he knew. He saw the water vapour that had once been his granddaughter emanating from the chimney of the great house. And he gathered up that vapour, and using his magic, in time, he was able to recreate her. But that is another story, and the end of this one. Happy Yule.